You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
The views expressed by the individuals during this broadcast are their own opinions, and they may not be the same as those of their group or other organizations they may be involved with.
All medical advice during our broadcast is not a medical opinion and should be checked with your medical physician.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I would like to thank you for joining us, and more importantly, our special guest tonight, who is joining us, which is Major Neill Franklin, who is retired. He was able to join us. If you're unaware, there was a hurricane that just happened, and it came right through where he lives, and we're thankful that he was able to have electricity and to be able to join us today. So thank you, Neill, and all the best to your family and friends and your surrounding community there in Florida there.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me this evening. Truly blessed, and you're right, electricity just came back, so we're going to have a good show here, hopefully. Great questions you guys have for me.
Well, thank you very much. As due to your law enforcement experience, there were various issues that have come up for us as veterans. We just spent an interesting couple of days up on Capitol Hill. We had 26 meetings, and we met with all different types of law enforcement, basically, based on the Armed Services and Veteran Services committees. And many things came up for us while we were there, but at the same time, we wanted to reach out to an experienced law enforcement professional because more questions came up for us that we were just kind of curious about. And so with that in mind, I'm going to kind of go into our first question, which is, we were curious, since how do your fellow law enforcement officials at your level, being that you were a high-ranking officer, you've come up through the ranks, how do your fellow law enforcement at your level feel about cannabis prohibition? You were led to enforce it over the decades, and you have, and being, needless to say, extremely seasoned. How do those officers and yourself feel about it after all these years, or decades, really?
Yeah, well, I would say that the feelings are rather mixed. And a lot of it depends upon your background, okay? For instance, most of the commanders at my level, if their background is narcotics investigation, maybe criminal investigation, maybe coming from a place where they've been able to use cannabis prohibition laws to their benefit in the work that they do, you would find that many of them still support it. If their work has been relative to, drug and addiction on highways, and, for those who are familiar with our strategies when we're doing drug and addiction on highways, when we're looking for drugs like cocaine and heroin, and unfortunately now fentanyl is being trafficked up and down our interstate highways and more. When you're looking for that, cannabis, marijuana is that one way that we can easily get into your car, into your truck, on your boat, whatever it may be that we're looking at, because of its distinct odor. But now, as we're starting to change state by state, there are a number of states that have already said, well, we, law enforcement, can no longer use the odor of marijuana to search. It's no longer probable cause to search, and legislation has been passed at our state levels to deal with that. But if you're from a place of, say you're at my level in policing, structure-wise, as a commander and maybe you oversee community policing efforts. Maybe you oversee some administrative efforts. Maybe you oversee, maybe you're running a precinct and patrol or more. Maybe you have a command area, a broad area that you oversee, and you're trying to improve relationships with those people in the community so that you can get more information to solve violent crimes. Because any commander that really knows his or her business in policing, they know that you can't solve violent crime in that community without the input, consistent input, information coming from the community. And we know, the evidence is clear, it's there. Just look in New York City, where we, stop and frisk, where we've had that issue for a while. We know that cannabis, marijuana, creates a barrier. When you're enforcing those minor cannabis laws, it creates a barrier between police and community and citizens. So it depends on your background, and where your work is in policing. But I will say this: if you go back 20 years and you ask that question, the vast majority would not be in agreement with moving forward and ending prohibition of cannabis. But what has changed really in that 20-year period is education, not just for the general public, but it's really changed for law enforcement on a number of different levels. And I know that we'll get into that during our conversation tonight.
Well, thank you. That's a very enlightened perspective. And needless to say, we appreciate you again coming out, because we don't usually have the opportunity to talk with officers straight to face about cannabis or prohibition itself, much less talk to experienced brass. So we appreciate again you taking the time. The next will be Council Member Al Byrne with our next question.
Major thanks again for being with us tonight. It's really an honor to have you here. And wow, what you just said to me was amazing. Listen, my question is, we have the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, as an organization of the federal government, and it has created a
Al, I lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
Got him.
He froze. The question is, what are your thoughts on the ATF singling out cannabis for special warnings when it is certainly not the only Schedule I substance to be made legal by a state law?
So when I'm going to speak a little bit about ATF, but when I speak about ATF, we have to understand something about our federal law enforcement organizations. ATF, DEA, and FBI work closely together. I mean, they're joined at the hip under the Department of Justice. And if you know anything about the history of the DEA, recent history of the DEA relative to its thoughts on cannabis, you know that they're not inclined to move in the direction that we want them to move in, ending its prohibition. If you just go back just a few years to Michelle Leonard, when she was being interviewed, I mean, she was being questioned by members of Congress, she was being questioned by others regarding comparing cannabis to drugs like heroin or meth, and those drugs that are in that Schedule I category. And she was, it was an interesting interview where she kept saying that, well, all drugs are dangerous and cannabis, basically she was trying to make a case for keeping cannabis in a Schedule I category, when just about everybody knows that it shouldn't be there. Many know that it shouldn't even be scheduled. But I say this, just to say that ATF and the FBI are going to support what the DEA say about a particular drug regarding its scheduling system. They're going to back each other up. So relative, to this question about, again, ATF singling it out relative to guns. What can we say? I mean, until Congress moves on it, that's going to be their position. Until we get our legislative body to finally step forward and say, okay, enough of this, it's over. We're going to change it. We're going to end the prohibition of it. ATF is going to be there. They're going to continue to hold these their positions on relative to guns and the possession of guns and the purchasing of guns. The FBI is going to be right there with them. DA is obviously going to be right there with them. So we got to get Congress to move on this. But you ask individual members of ATF, you have individual members of DEA, those folks who are working in the trenches. They're just like in regular law enforcement that we just talked about. Their positions have changed quite a bit. But the hierarchy, those folks at the top, they're political, and whatever the political rhetoric is, that's where they're going to be. They're not going to step out of line.
Yeah, they're they kind of follow the flow of things altogether, unfortunately, which we always kind of hope that they would have their own individual mindset, but that's not necessarily the way things were set up. And you
absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely not. And just real quick, when we're talking about this, is one of the things that we've been working on in LEAP. We have numerous discussions around, and LEAP, for those who don't know, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, is trying to separate politics from policing, trying to separate as much as we can politics from law enforcement, so that you don't have this political pressure to enforce laws that we know are archaic, that should not be enforced. The political pressure causes so much heartache among the ranks. And if we can move away from that, if we can, however we can, wherever we can, it's always a good thing for policing and what we do within in our communities.
Thank you for that. Next up will be Councilmember Nate Landau.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can.
First of all, thank you so much for joining our show. My question is the ATF's policy costing lives because they are they're discouraging their members from not using cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder as a treatment that we all know really works? Is that a policy that you think is costing lives?
Well,
because they're
Nate, I'm a firm believer that it's costing lives in a number of different ways. Let me first begin with the rank and file members. We know that we have enormous amounts, just like with veterans, we know that we have enormous amounts of PTSD among the ranks. You look at our suicide rate in policing, extremely high, extremely high. You look at alcoholism among the ranks, extremely high. And when compared to the national average of people across the country, if you're a police officer, your PTSD levels are extremely high. Your rates of suicide, your chances of committing suicide are extremely high. Alcoholism and yes, drug use are extremely high. You will find that drug use mainly in the area of prescription drugs for a number of different reasons, obviously. The domestic issues and abuse, extremely high within the ranks of policing. I can go on and on. We know that there are police officers across this country, I've talked to many myself, who would love to be able to use cannabis to deal with their issues of PTSD. All right, we know that. They are quite familiar with some of the work that many of you have done. And some of the progress that's been made with managing PTSD among veterans. They know that. They talk to veterans. They know it works. They know that there are people dealing with PTSD who have been able to get off of these very powerful and problematic pharmaceutical drugs, right? So because the federal government has yet to move, police departments across this country will not cross that line. They just won't do it in allowing their people to use medicinal cannabis. And it's a shame. I know of one police officer, I will not mention his name because his case is still being adjudicated administratively and probably soon civilly. But because he's still dealing with some things administratively in a very large Maryland police department, this police officer has come to us, has come to LEAP, seeking help because what he did, knowing how medical cannabis can help him with his psychological issues, including PTSD, he started using it. He actually applied for, and he did it the right way according to Maryland law. He applied for a card, medical cannabis card. So he did it the right way. He wasn't using it while he was on duty, and he wasn't using it so close to going on duty, going on a clock that he would be under the influence. Very smart, doing it the right way, but now he's got issues. And now he's being administratively pursued by his agency because of this. So they're not only police officers that know it works, want to use it because they don't want to lose their lives. And here's something else they also notice. Number one, like this particular police officer's family life is better, his home life is better, right? He again is no longer taking those pharmaceutical drugs that he was using to manage depression, right? No longer using alcohol the way he was to go to sleep at night and to manage. So he thought he was managing depression using alcohol, right? So he was using prescription drugs that were not prescribed to him, which is illegal. So these are some of the things that he was doing. So in addition to it being better for them in managing depression, PTSD, so in hopes that they do not take their own lives. And yes, in policing, we've known police officers to not just take their own lives, but also to take the lives of their family members at the same time. But here's something else that we also know. Because of the depression, because of the unmitigated psychological issues that police officers are dealing with, the force that they use when they are enforcing laws, the force that they use on citizens when they are enforcing law tend to be extreme. Okay, because what they're holding in is going to manifest itself at the first opportunity. So they're going to lash out, they're going to strike out, usually beginning verbally with verbal abuse of citizens, doing traffic stops, doing other calls for service. They're cursing at citizens, they're mistreating them, and then it escalates into the physical force. So we know that to be a fact. And as we know across this country, unfortunately, police officers have and continue to take the lives of many people when I know and I firmly believe that other courses of action could have been taken. Not just the instant when the deadly force was being used, but from the onset of the interaction with the citizen, de-escalation was an option in many of these cases, but it never even got to that before deadly force was used. So we know that if our police officers are healthier, mentally healthier, that they're going to interact and treat the citizens better. They're going to use their judgment much better. They're going to do a better job of keeping emotion out of, a situation that they encounter. So it's not just safer for the lives of the police officers and those close to them, but it's safer for the lives of the citizens who they interact with on a daily basis.
Oh, That is.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to add that in Canada, all law enforcement and all military, when they're off duty, they're allowed to consume that.
Well, unfortunately, this is the United States, and we're not supposed to follow other countries. Other countries follow us.
Well, unfortunately, we're using other countries' policies to help change our own U.S. policies, and one is the Canadian Veterans Policy, because they actually give away 3 grams of cannabis to their veterans who receive 100% disability. So that's 3 grams per day, any modality, and ordered and coming directly to you. So
I did not know that. That's fantastic. Thanks for that information.
That's a program they've been running since 2007, and they spent last year about $120 million providing their veteran service members with that free cannabis. So that's one of the things that we were talking on Capitol Hill that we're trying to do, is get introductions between them. So next up is Council Member Michael Green for question number 4.
Well, again, thank you so much, ATM, and thank you so much for being our guest this evening. What you've just said, in response to the previous 3 questions, all fascinating. That, and the question we had drafted for number 4 dovetails very tightly into what has preceded. Our questions originally drafted is, what are your thoughts about the desire within active police ranks to use medical cannabis in their amongst themselves? And you've begun to address that. The example of the Maryland officer obviously comes up, and what you've said about reduction in violence, not only towards themselves, abuse, etc., amongst police officers, but how they approach the public is fascinating to me. So 2 things occur to me. One, to the extent that local agencies, states where cannabis would otherwise be legal, is it the finances of federal policy and the interaction between the monies that federal government provides states? Is that a major factor? And 2, amongst membership, rank and file, is there a growing consensus, and is there a time where that'll actually be manifest itself in some kind of political pushback where a positive change may be enacted?
Okay, so a couple of quick points. First of all, just to add to my desire regarding active police officers and using cannabis, medical cannabis. I was kind of excited a little while ago when New Jersey passed its adult use for cannabis in general, right? And, part of that policy was for law enforcement to be able to use cannabis, not just medicinally, but period. While off duty, of course, while off duty, just like alcohol, use it off duty, you can't come to work under the influence. But things are on hold there for now. We're eventually going to get there. It's no doubt in my mind. So obviously my desire is that police officers and many folks who are employed in a number of different disciplines, that they be able to use the same way they would be able to use alcohol while off duty. Obviously, you cannot come to work under the influence. If the employer says you cannot be under the influence while working for them, then fine. But while you're off duty, I believe it would be beneficial in a number of different ways. Not just medicinally for policemen, but generally speaking, I think there would be a number of police officers after a very strenuous day in the streets of a city like Baltimore to go home and to relax with some cannabis instead of a 6 or 12 pack of beer or a bottle of wine or a 5th of Jack Daniels or whatever they might be sucking at. I think it obviously would be more healthy. It would be healthier for them. And I think it would go a long way in helping them to effectively release and manage that stress that they encounter, many of them encounter on a daily basis. So obviously that's, how I personally feel about that. Regarding the money that law enforcement may be receiving, and they do receive for certain levels of drug enforcement, to my knowledge, there's no longer anything that specifically addresses cannabis enforcement. However, there are still funds available through the Department of Justice for drug enforcement. I just heard, now, she didn't mention any money when I heard the current head of the DEA speak a few days ago about the influx of fentanyl coming in to the country in the form of pills, multicolored pills, which she says is very attractive to children who would happen to come across these or see them. And I don't disagree with that, not one bit at all. But she's talking about ramping up, here we go, drug war, no longer 101. This is drug war like 2.5 or 2.8. We're taking it to the next level. She's talking about doing the same things over and over again, going after the cartels south of the border, spending who knows how much money doing that. You know, we've seen this movie over and over again, but here's how law enforcement does that. The most effective way to stop and search cars and trucks and people on our highways and in our cities to look for other drugs like fentanyl or heroin or what have you. The most effective way to do that, to get into someone's pockets, which I mentioned earlier, is the odor of cannabis, is the odor of marijuana, whether it's burning or whether it's, you know, sometimes large, you know, bundles of marijuana you can smell. But the burning odor, which most police officers are very familiar with and trained in many of our states can still use that burning odor as probable cause to search you or your car. Now, when those dollars are attached to finding drugs like fentanyl, finding drugs like heroin and cocaine, and reporting those numbers back to the Department of Justice, you know, to satisfy a grant application so that you can get more funds, then yeah, a good way to get into someone's house or car to search is cannabis. So that's kind of the nuance relative to that.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because it occurs to me, if that were the case, and if drug enforcement continued to step up and made those stops, claiming they had probable cause, but found nothing, which would have to these days be more often the truth than not. We're not talking about mules running 50 kilos in from Arizona here. You're talking about some serious drugs with heroin, fentanyl, et cetera, I would have to surmise statistically, it'd be looking like we're wasting like a tremendous amount of money on less than meaningful stops as opposed to real interdiction. Well, so I don't know if you want to respond to that comment, and then please.
Yeah, you don't have to wonder about that. You're absolutely correct. The statistics are extremely low. You see, because not just for finding, you know, harder drugs are those numbers extremely low when they stop someone and search them because of the odor of, they claim the odor of cannabis. But those numbers are extremely low for finding harder drugs. They're also extremely low for finding guns. The police know that they know it's just a matter of numbers. The more cars they stop and search, the more people they stop on street corners and search. It's just it's numbers. It's a law of averages. You're eventually going to find harder drugs. You're eventually going to find, you know, guns, but you're violating the rights of people. You know, you're stepping all over their constitutional rights. And it's just not right. And then you have the racial implications that come with that as well. But go ahead.
No, exactly right. So I guess even though this wasn't a question we formulated earlier, do you have an opinion what it's going to take to wake up organizations under the Justice Department like the FBI, DA, et cetera, and maybe the federal government, Congress, and the president to, for lack of a better term, maybe nobody likes this, just get woke about cannabis and move on to the things that certainly are more important?
Well, what may happen before Congress gets to the point where they move, what could happen before that to help it on? Maybe a lawsuit or two, right? Maybe it's something for the higher courts to deal with. I mean, it's about time. I mean, we kind of thought that we were kind of like almost at critical mass. because I like to look at history. I like to look at history, when things change. And if we look at alcohol prohibition, it was state by state that decided, you know what, we're no longer going to enforce the 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol. And Maryland, my home state, was the one state that never ever agreed to enforce it. But as each state made it known that they're no longer going to enforce the prohibition of alcohol, the 18th Amendment, as more and more states came online, the federal government finally had to say, okay, it's over. And they passed another amendment to end it. I kind of thought that we're probably there, at least. I'm telling you, when we get through November, when we have a number of additional states, Maryland being one of those, where the people are going to decide that it's over, then maybe this will be the turning point. Maybe after this election in November, maybe we'll have enough critical mass via the states to get Congress to move. And if not, like I said, maybe a lawsuit or two that are in play might have something to do with helping to move that ball across the finish line.
All right, thank you very much. Next, Wade Laughter has a follow-up question.
Yes, thank you, Chen. And I really want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, this evening. I have all kinds of respect for persons who are willing to do police work. Back in the day, I lived in San Francisco for years, rode motorcycle, got to know cops who rode motorcycle for the San Francisco Police Department. And yeah, I would run into them at this one specific bar and got to be friends with more than a few of them. And one of the things I came to realize is one of the things that's hardest about your job, you spoke about PTSD, and in a police officer's day, every single person they interact with is having one of the worst days of their life, right? Over and over and over and over, simply because you needed to come there, be it because someone was killed or there was a robbery or a horrible car accident, whatever. And that stress is cumulative. And some of these guys and gals at that point actually were heroic at their consumption of alcohol. That's really where I'm going with this. And they were friends, and I felt like it was hard to watch them slowly killing themselves. Alcohol is a poison. And I really, I know I'm saying a lot about myself here, but I'd really love for you to maybe talk a little bit more about how cannabis could have a different effect in the lives of not just the officers who do this duty for our culture and communities, but also for their families. I mean, you made reference to that in passing, but I'll stop there, sir. And thank you again for joining us. I'd love to hear your response. Thank you.
Yeah. Just real quick about the alcohol use, and I'm going to mention two TV shows that are very much real to life. One is extremely real to life. I mean, it's a very accurate depiction. The first one being the HBO series The Wire, and unfortunately, both of them are about Baltimore. And I speak to that because I'm very familiar with Baltimore and Baltimore policing. The HBO series The Wire, if you remember, there were a number of different scenes in that series. It's a 5-year series. One a particular bar that the police officers would frequent, after work, and they would get extremely intoxicated. And there's nothing worse than an intoxicated police officer who believes that they're above the law. They become intoxicated and they go out and do things. Their behavior is obnoxious because they carry this badge in their hip pocket and a gun on their hip, and then, you know, and they know if they get stopped by another police officer because someone calls in a complaint, or they get stopped for driving while under the influence, then it's most likely that they're not going to be held accountable for that behavior. So, you know, in episode after episode, you see this real life depiction of what happens at this particular bar, you know, and how intoxicated these police officers get. A second show is more recent. This is about the gun trace task force in Baltimore that was recently discovered, and, you know, big case by the FBI, uncovering this squad of police officers who were out committing robberies of people. They were committing home invasions of people. They were stealing drugs, selling drugs, stealing money, you name it. They were doing it, planning evidence, whole laundry list of things. And as a matter of fact, the FBI is still looking into the Baltimore Police Department because there are probably others who are somewhere involved on the peripheral. But if you watch that, you know, they would have the shift parties, you know, where they go drinking, but right behind the police station, the precinct, the district station, after work. They would go out to these strip clubs and become extremely intoxicated, abusing the patrons as well as the sex workers at these clubs. You know, and it doesn't stop there. It goes home with them. So this is where I'm leading. You know, they go home intoxicated, and they go home and they become intoxicated while there. It affects their children. You know, we know that alcoholism, whether it's psychological or otherwise, can be transferred from a parent to a child. You know, seeing this day in and day out. You know, we know that kids mimic their parents. Many of them want to be like their parents. But this causes a lot of trouble at home. You know, we do get a lot of calls in policing, you know, to the homes of police officers who had been drinking, who are intoxicated. And it doesn't do a lot of good for the home life, their spouse or their children, whoever else might be in that household at the time. But again, that second show, it's called We Own This City. I forgot to give you the title. It's called We Own This City. And it's a very short series. Again, I believe it's by HBO, but I encourage you to watch that as well. And you can just see how much drinking goes on. And I'll end with this. So did you understand that this show, We Own This City, is a real life depiction? The writers of that show are actual media, newspaper investigators of that gun trace task force. They use the actual court dockets, the court records, the records from the FBI and their investigation, interviews. It's so real that they use the actual names of everyone who's involved. They don't substitute names. They use the actual name of the sergeant, the actual name of a police officer, the actual name of the captain and the commissioner and the state's attorney and all of that. This is real. I mean, it's horrible. If we could just, again, the difference that substituting alcohol with cannabis would make is just unfreaking believable. And every cop knows this. And the reason every cop knows this is because whenever you get called to an incident involving violence, it's highly likely that someone's intoxicated. Not all the time, but highly likely that someone's intoxicated. And every one of these police officers will tell you that they probably have never had, like me, have never had a call of violence where the person was under the influence of cannabis alone. Never. And if you find a police officer who handled a call of violence and the perpetrator was using cannabis only, it's going to be extremely rare, or maybe the person had some underlying mental health issues prior to using the cannabis.
Yes, that one is usually the most important one there. Next up is Gage Ansler. Gage.
Major, it's a pleasure to have you on here. So absolutely good to see you and good to talk to you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks,
I don't think there's a lot of data on this topic, but it seems that rural police departments are more likely to enforce cannabis laws than, say, urban police departments. And maybe this could be because that rural areas are more likely to be conservative and maybe have less tolerant attitudes towards cannabis use. So do you see a difference, personally, do you see a difference in approach in rural versus urban, in rural versus urban responses to cannabis uses? And I'm talking maybe between state police departments, local border patrol, sheriff departments, range in that range. What's your opinion on that?
Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see a direct correlation with, earlier we talked about federal organizations, right? ATF, FBI, DEA, so on. So if you start there at that, 40,000 foot view of law enforcement being the feds, and you work your way down, then you come down around 20,000, 25,000 feet, this is your state law enforcement organization. And then you keep coming down, now you've got your major cities, and then all the way down to your rural and small town police departments. I think that you'll find, generally speaking, is that the farther down you come, the more likely you're to find a police department that is in line with using cannabis off duty, at least for medicinal purposes. And the politics is just completely different, as I mentioned earlier. It's easier to get things done at a local level than it is at one of these bureaucratic, overly bureaucratic, bureaucratic institutions like the FBI and the DEA, ATF. Even my agency, the Maryland State Police, and the bureaucracy, the politics at the governor's level, in the state house, and blah, blah, blah. It's just crazy. Then you get down to cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. You still have the politics there. But you get down to, say, like a sheriff's department, sheriff's office, where if you have a progressive, forward-thinking, forward-looking sheriff that says, this is nonsense, especially if they ran on that platform, right? So I've run into sheriffs who have run on a platform of, this cannabis prohibition is ridiculous, right? Because we know that the vast majority of the public agrees with them. So they run on that, they win on that. And so that now they're not afraid to say, what, it's ridiculous. Our state just passed the law, to make it legal. We're not going to be out there enforcing these laws. We're not going to be doing this. We're not going to be doing that. And they have the support of their constituents because they're elected into office. They're going to do what the people want them to do. But unfortunately, at the governor's level, for instance, at the say state police superintendent at his level or her level, for instance, they're put into that position by the governor. The governor can yank them just as easy and quickly as he put them into that position. So they're going to, whatever the governor's position is, that's their position, no matter what they know, no matter what their education level is regarding cannabis and cannabis use, they're going to side with the governor. They're going to play that role. So again, as you come down closer to the people with these smaller agencies, sheriff's department, you're going to find a different perspective. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm here in Florida, and we have sheriffs here in Florida that think cannabis is the most evil thing on the face of the planet. So again, I'm just, generally speaking, that's what we see. And, it's just easier to make decisions at the local level and than what it is at some of these higher, heavy, bureaucratic with bureaucracy and
Gotcha. That more talk, less walk. So understand that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
Camelford Lifestyle Shop, open Monday to Friday from 10 till 7 p.m. or by chance. Check out our flags, our t-shirts, plus our hats, and look of that supply of rolling papers, plus much more. We've got bongs and your favorite herbal vaporizers. Look at all the incense we have, as well as for those who collect knives, check out these knives in our collection. And while you're here, stop in to see Shay at the piercing room, where you can get poked by Shay. Daily deals, check them out. Camelford Lifestyle Shop, 17 Bridge Street West, Camelford, Ontario.
What do you find at paceradio.net? People advocating cannabis education.
Limestone City Hydroponics is Kingston, Ontario's hydroponics shop. Take your growing to the next level and create the optimal environment with a tent kit, or maximize your yield with an ebb and flow flood table kit. Either way, Limestone City Hydroponics has more sizes and options to fit your needs. Are you looking for the power of the sun that adapts to your budget? Then look no further, as they have professional grow lighting. They have indoor grow systems that are easy and cost effective, with many options to fit your living space and lifestyle. Cultivate your growing potential. We have everything you need to succeed. And if you can't make it to the store, they offer local delivery to the greater Kingston area. Remember, when you're looking for experts to help you grow, then look no further than the locally owned Limestone City Hydroponics, 105 Sunderland Drive in Kingston, Ontario. Call them at 613-548-0420.
Rerolled Saturdays. Check it out. Nothing but non-stop cannabis and psychedelic programming. Find it at 420pace.ca. You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
Next up is Council Member Tony Landry.
Welcome. Thank you, Neill, for being here tonight. And my question is, how do you feel about driving under the influence of cannabis? In terms, maybe comparison to alcohol or some other drug or.
So earlier I talked about crimes of violence, alcohol, people using alcohol versus people using cannabis, and what I see and what we generally see in policing. People using the alcohol, violent, people using the cannabis are just so relaxed and so chill for the most part. And I've never arrested. Now, understand something. When I was working the road, I was at the one barrack that I worked at the longest. It was between me and this other trooper. We were the highest DUI riders in that part of the state, not just in that barracks or in that county, in that part of the state. I've stopped people who I thought were under the influence of cannabis, but I stopped them for something altogether different. I could smell it. And some of them admitted to using it. But prior to stopping them, I didn't see a driving behavior that would cause me to question their ability to drive. I'd give them a field sobriety test. And again, their balance was fine. They could answer my questions and all that. I say that to say I've never arrested anyone for driving strictly under the influence of cannabis. Now, they may have been smoking cannabis and also drinking, then yeah, they got arrested. But never just for cannabis. Again, I arrested numerous people for driving while under the influence of alcohol, whether they were involved in an accident, as many of them were, whether they were just all over the road, step out of the car and they practically fall flat on their faces. But I must say, hundreds, if not close to I probably arrested maybe 500 to 600 people for DUI in my career. And not one of those arrests were for someone strictly under the influence of cannabis. And I want to say something here, because you'll hear our elected officials and others who are against ending the prohibition of cannabis. You'll hear them scream and jump up and down, oh, there's going to be more people out driving under the influence of cannabis, making our roads more dangerous, blah, 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 blah. Now stick with me here on this. So here's something that people have to understand. Is that number one, there are already a lot of people out there driving while under the influence of cannabis. There always have been, and these are people who, if they've had too much to smoke, where their judgment and their motor skills are influenced at a level where they're dangerous, to themselves and others on the highway, then that person is a lawbreaker. Okay, so they break the law, just like someone who drinks too much and goes out and gets behind the wheel of a car and they're intoxicated. They're lawbreakers. So yes, we do have a number of people out there who smoke too much and drive, and they're lawbreakers. But they've been out there, they're going to be out there because you know what? They break the law. Now understand something though. The additional people who will start smoking cannabis once it becomes legal, they're not lawbreakers because they're waiting. They're waiting for us to say it's legal, now you can smoke. So why would they become lawbreakers all of a sudden, smoke too much and go drive a car when they shouldn't? So my point is, there won't be an increase in people dangerously driving while under the influence of alcohol, because the increase in the user population are law-abiding citizens. They're not going to all of a sudden break the law. And then you know what? And you look at the data doesn't reflect that. You know why? Because you'll have a study over here that says it does, and you'll have a study over here that says it doesn't. So there's no, I'm going to say, there's not enough cooperation out there among these studies to say that in these states where cannabis is now legal, that our roads have become more dangerous because of people driving under the influence of cannabis. The evidence just isn't there, so, but again, if someone, even those that probably have had too much to smoke and drive, they're not driving 30 miles over the speed limit. Like some of these people who are intoxicated by alcohol, they might be driving, 10 or 20 under the speed limit. But anyway, I'm not one to, I don't believe, seriously do not believe that our roads become more dangerous because of us making cannabis legal for adults to use or for medical patients to use.
Well, our last question, you kind of answered outright, because it was basically all about driving under the influence and your thoughts on driving under the influence in cannabis. So I put up another question for Tony. So Tony Landry, you want to go ahead with that question?
Yeah, sure. At what year did you realize, or did you come to realization that the drug war was an absolute failure? Does that sound right?
Yeah. So I would say that it really didn't even happen within like 1 year. It was a process for me. And I think it was a somewhat of a lengthy process for me, is because many of you know that I spent a lot of years in drug investigation, in policing. I mean, man, I not only drank the Kool-Aid, I was making the Kool-Aid. You know, I was the one in the kitchen with the big, you know, glass pitcher with the smiley face on it, and packs of Kool-Aid, and a, you know, 5-pound bag of sugar, just mixing the Kool-Aid. Because I not only worked undercover, I commanded drug task forces. I commanded a whole region in the state of Maryland, you know, of 9 drug task forces at one time. So I'm not just going out there doing the work. I'm ordering people to do it. I'm giving them direction, and I'm feeding them this propaganda that I was taught about why we had to do this. And I was doing this with a lack of education about the history of drugs and the history of our drug laws in this country. And so I started in my later years as a commander, commanding drug task forces. I started to see a little sparkle or glimpse here and there about some things that just didn't seem right, how we would target certain communities of color. So I began with seeing an imbalance in how we applied the law, you know, in certain communities. Same thing with poor communities. Knowing that we had drugs in some of our affluent communities, we didn't dare touch those communities. We didn't dare go into a affluent community with drug dogs and just randomly scan cars for drugs, because we'd find ourselves, you know, reassigned the next day to some worthless job. But in poor communities, we just had a ball. You know, we thought it was fun. So, but when I got to the end of my career with the Maryland State Police, I started working for the Baltimore Police Department as the head of training. And this was in the year 2000. And it was a good friend of mine, Ed Totley, who was working undercover for the Maryland State Police. He had worked a number of cases for me under my command. And he was working with the FBI October 30th, one night when he was making what was supposed to be a final buy of cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. And he was assassinated that night by a drug dealer. He was shot point blank range in his head. And that moment kind of made me start paying attention to the violence that surrounded the drug trade. And it was easier for me to do because now I was out of the Maryland State Police and I was in a different role completely, training. And in Baltimore City, around that same time, we had 2 police officers who were killed by local drug dealers in the city. And so I'm starting to see these pictures of violence surrounding the drug trade. And then I think what was really critical, that 2 years after Ed was killed, I was still working in Baltimore City. It moved from police violence being recipients of the violence to citizens being recipients of the violence, be it that an entire family of 7, mother, father, and 5 kids were killed in one night by the neighborhood drug dealer who had set up shop on a corner right outside of their home. And she was doing what we tell every citizen to do: work with us, come work with us, the police, give us the information we need on these people selling these dangerous drugs in your neighborhood. Work with us and we'll come clean them up and, you know, make the arrest and take them away, and you'll be in a better position. She started working with the police, giving us information on this drug dealer and his crew, the mother, Angela. She wasn't afraid that her boys would become addicted to drugs. Her fear was that her boys would be recruited by this crew and then would be in a completely dangerous situation. She knew that their lives would be over, either in jail or dead. So she started working with the police. When this guy found out about it, the head of this crew, he said it was time to send a message that you don't screw with him or his money. And he set their home on fire in the middle of the night while they were asleep, killed the entire family. So it made me I started paying attention to the bodies, right? The shootings, the shootouts, the retaliation, the people getting caught in the crossfire, these kids. And I eventually, even though locally I was doing some searching, I eventually stumbled across Jack Cole and the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And I just started meeting other cops who started feeling the same way, and many for different reasons. But that journey, which started my education, my true education regarding our drug policies and drugs in this country, led me on to seeing our prison population and what that was about. It led me on to seeing and understanding what was doing more harm to policing than any other set of policies in this country. And I love policing. And I quickly learned that our drug prohibition policies have separated us more from the people we're supposed to be serving than anything else you can think of. I started learning that these drug prohibition policies, if we were to end, would solve more ancillary issues and problems in our society within our society and in any other single issue on the globe. Those set of prohibition drug policies would solve so many other issues, not just in this country, but globally. Immigration, right? It would solve the cartels who are doing things other than moving drugs. They're heavily into human trafficking. It would strike such a blow to those organizations and organized crime. It would be unimaginable. It would allow us to end the stigma of drug use in this country. And again, this conversation we're having tonight, regarding being able to use cannabis for PTSD, not just cannabis, but to explore more in the world of psychedelics for PTSD issues, right? It would solve it would solve so many issues. I think it would strike a blow to alcoholism in this country as well, no doubt. But and child abuse and physical and mental child abuse. I mean, the list is long. Poverty issues that would definitely do wonders for our overburdened prison population in this country. I mean, we could sit here and talk all day about, or all evening, about the things that would happen. So that place of violence, starting my road of education, that started over 20 something years ago, and my education is still continuing today. And I'll end with this. Regarding this journey of education that I've had and continue to have, those that have been introduced like I have to this education, to learning the history, to learning other things, I don't care what your journey is like. I don't care what your discipline is. I don't care what you've done, what you plan to do. Once you've started this journey toward ending prohibition of cannabis or anything else, once you start down that road, I've yet to meet anyone that has stopped, turned around, and headed back toward prohibition. Not one single person, and I've met thousands. They may have slowed down a little bit, but they've never reversed their direction once they started moving to where we are on these issues. Some make it all the way to the end, like I have. Some pause in the middle, only go as far as cannabis, only go as far as psychedelics, but no one has ever turned around and headed back in the other direction.
Going along that line of discussion, I think Wade Laughter had a follow-up.
Yeah, again, I really wanted to thank you for joining us this afternoon. This has been an amazing and educational conversation. My question originally was about the interest in particularly mushrooms, but other forms of psychedelic therapy. But you brought it up and covered it pretty thoroughly, that you think there's area of interest there, and then made reference to the idea of decriminalizing drugs as a whole. I was going to ask you what you thought about how Portugal is handling drugs in the use of drugs in their communities. But you've just done an amazing job of covering the bulk of what I wanted to ask you about already. And so I guess I'll just close again by thanking you for taking the time to talk with us this afternoon. And I think we could all look forward to ending the war on drugs and treating drug addiction, because there are drugs that have high potential for addiction and little, if any, redeeming medical value, which is the whole concept of scheduling. But cannabis obviously doesn't fit in there. And I think informed as versus political choices would be ideal in this area of policy. And I'll stop there, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned Portugal just real quick. Absolutely wonderful. Their harm reduction approach to drug use is just, it's special. And I know that members of the law enforcement community, high-ranking folks, have made trips, along with some of our political folks, have made trips over to Portugal and have looked in deeply into their program over there. I'm very excited about it. Unfortunately, it hasn't moved too much here. But when you look at things like psychedelics, you know, we worked on decriminalizing them in the district, you know, in Washington, D.C. We worked on some of those policies out in the Northwest. We worked on some of those issues in Canada, by the way, along with cannabis in Canada. We had a very strong branch up there in Canada right prior to them legalizing cannabis there. But psychedelics, I just returned a couple of weeks ago from a retreat in upstate New York of law enforcement folks who were talking about police officer wellness, health and wellness. And it was primarily about psychedelics. What do we think about the potential? You know, and it followed really what you guys have done in the veteran community regarding the use of psychedelics with PTSD. I'm excited about that. Again, I was advocating for it. We've been working with MAPS for a very long time, you know, regarding psychedelics and decriminalizing psychedelics, and, you know, the research that still needs to be done and should be done. But this retreat really got me excited. And, you know, hoping that somewhere soon down the road, we can begin the use of psychedelics within the law enforcement community as it relates to, you know, PTSD, depression, and some of the other things that we're challenged with and dealing with.
Thank you. Councilmember Al Byrne, you have a follow-up.
No, actually, I don't. Neill, the talk of Portugal just gave me a question. As you're aware, the medical community in the United States is pretty much centered on their own research. In other words, I've used the term ethnocentric a lot. The research that our government looks at is ethnocentric U.S. research, whereas the rest of the world has done quite a bit of research on their own. And while that other research medically is ignored, I'm wondering if it's the same for law enforcement. I mean, you have a place like Portugal, you have countries like the Netherlands where cannabis has been some sort of legalization for quite a while. Has their violence level dropped in these places, or has it increased? And the next part of the question is, just like the medical situation, does anybody in the United States pay attention to that?
Yeah, so again, that's one of the reasons we have been advocating for, and LEAP was also trying to build its own coalition of law enforcement police chiefs to send over to Portugal. And you're absolutely right, the violence has decreased in places like Portugal. But one place in particular is Switzerland, where Switzerland has a heroin maintenance program, and what the police, initially when, President Dreyfus in Switzerland, implemented this program, they weren't on board. But then when they started in violent crime, property crime, and theft, they immediately, got on board with it, because as any police officer would tell you, many times when it comes down to these robberies and these thefts and so on that you see on a daily basis all the time, it's users who are trying to get the money they need to support their habits, right? So, because we've created a society that pushes them out to the margins of society, right? We ostracize them, we kick them out of their jobs, out of employment, they have no money, we put them in jail, they come back out, they can't get employed. However, they still have their addiction and they still feel the need to feed that addiction. So what do they have to do? They have to buy it from an illicit market, which means they don't have a job, they got to go steal money, they got to go rob somebody. So the police started saying, wow, this is great, we're seeing reductions in these types of crime. So yes, the evidence is there. But again, the challenge is getting our people here to admit that we were wrong, to admit that we do not have the best or the right approach to dealing with this issue of drug use in our country. It's very difficult it was difficult for me. It's very difficult for a police officer who spent so much time enforcing these laws, literally your entire career, enforcing these laws, and then to get 10, 20, 30 years into your career and to have someone tell you that, you know what, it wasn't, not only did you not make any progress, truly, you didn't make any, may have looked like progress, but when you gauge progress like this in policing, say you have rapes, or say you have burglaries in a particular area, and you finally latch onto the person who's committing the rapes, or you finally latch onto the small crew that's committing the burglaries or store robberies, you know what? The rapes go down, the robberies go down, the burglaries go down when you make those arrests. That's progress. That's clear, crystal clear evidence of progress. But when you take off a drug crew on a corner, the drug activity on that corner doesn't stop. Not only that, before you know it, you've got shootings now occurring within that 5 square block area. What happened? Well, you've just arrested the regulator of that 5 block area. You just arrested the crew that actually had the violence. Yeah, they were selling dope, but you know what? They had the violence under control. They had it tamped down because they want to make money. Now you've got a void in that marketplace, and now you've got the neighboring crews fighting for those valuable street corners. And so they shoot it out, and then you have retaliation. And you know what? You still got people selling drugs there. That's not progress. That's when you realize you've actually made things worse for your community. And when you tell a police officer that, when you explain that to them, when you really sit down with them and say, look, man, these laws we've been enforcing, we haven't really been doing all this good work for our communities. Let me tell you why. This is what happens. Bam, 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 bam. It's hard to accept. For me, it was hard to accept the fact that I arrested all these people for smoking marijuana. All these people, all they did was just smoke a little bit of weed, a little bit of cannabis, and maybe sell me a dime bag, back then, or, a couple of grams here, a couple of grams there. No violence whatsoever. And their freaking lives were ruined. Hundreds of people like this. Hundreds of people like this. And now to tell a cop that, you know what, that wasn't good for your neighborhood or your community. That actually made it worse. And here's why. You just gave all these people criminal records that they really didn't deserve because of these screwed up policies we had. Not that it was your fault, but you were taught something that and given a job to do that wasn't for the benefit of your society, for the benefit of your community. And this is why these people are now, for the most part, unemployable. That means they're a financial drain upon your community, your society. You know, these particular people, maybe that person was the head of a household. You know, you can go on and on with the list of people that you arrested and what happened to that family unit. Not just that person, but in many cases, that family unit, that household. You know, yeah, you arrested that person for selling a little bit of weed, but they weren't carrying guns. They weren't shooting people. They were making just enough money by selling weed to put food on the table, or maybe to pay that electric bill or to pay that rent. And now that income's not coming in, and that family is now out on the street, and they're now receiving money from social services. You know, he may have been doing this, but you know what? He had a great relationship with his kids, and he kept his kids in line. Now he's locked up. Where are his kids? So when you go through story after that and explain it to the cops, it's hard. It's a bitter pill to swallow to think that you've spent, 10, 20, 30 years doing this type of work. And not only was it for nothing, but in many ways, you probably made things worse for your community.
Councilmember Tony Landry has a follow-up.
Yeah, you had mentioned the psychedelics. I wanted to know if you were familiar with the Concord study in 1961 to 63. They gave psilocybin-assisted therapy to 32 prisoners on the reentry program, and it reduced the recidivism. Upon coming out of prison, they went through a ceremony, about a week of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and the majority of them didn't return back to prison. I was wondering what you thought on that, if you had ever heard of that study by, I think, Dr. Leary. I'm not sure the first name, but the Concord Prison Project study.
So I'm not familiar with that, but I'm not surprised at it, because the many people I've spoken to who have undergone the therapy, for whatever their issue or reason, they speak to not just how their lives have improved, but why, because of now how they see things and what they understand, and how they feel about the meaning of it all. So I haven't heard of it, but I'm not surprised at the results of that you just explained to me. Not at all.
Thank you.
Councilmember Todd Scatini.
How you doing, guys? Thanks, Neil, and please accept my apologies for showing up late. It is homecoming here in
No problem.
Missouri. So I just want to say thanks for giving your time tonight. I am the son of a Kern County Sheriff's deputy. I grew up in a cop house in California. Both my mom and my stepfather worked for the sheriff's department, and I saw, a lot of PTSD within, now I can recognize it as PTSD within their friend circle, and I watched them experience losing at least 5 members of their friend circle to suicide or other significant illnesses that were born from wearing the badge. And I was wondering if, did the police or does law enforcement look at the military and the veteran community as a real ally? Because I think we certainly have a synergy. Now after having spent 27 years in the Army and having seen kind of law enforcement from a kid's point of view, I recognize that a lot of the issues that we suffer from are very similar to what's going on in the law enforcement community. And I was wondering if there's any sort of potential for alliance or a coalition that we could create, because I think our voices really resonate together we are a certain class of society. We are the warrior society, and the law enforcement is a certain class of society that's so deeply respected, yet it is us who is judged by the content of our urine. And I feel like if the law enforcement officials would have access to cannabis, perhaps we could get a long way very quickly.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because obviously if you can build a coalition of folks and continue to grow that coalition, you can really get things done. Just real quick, and that's kind of like what LEAP is about, trying to assemble this coalition of folks, teach them what we've been taught, show them not just teach, but show them the data, give them the history, building a coalition on a number of different topics, obviously drug policy being one of those. We actually modeled the organization after veterans following the Vietnam War, right? And assembling these voices to help change the landscape, the policy landscape. And one of the challenges that we do have in policing is this. First of all, with retired folks from policing, piece of cakewalk. I mean, these guys get it. They don't feel the political pressure. They no longer feel the pressure of, a squad or a division can place upon you, or your patrol squad or whatever can place upon you while you're active. And my point is this, and this is why it tends to be so different for us in policing. So we have this thing in LEAP that when we're trying to convince law enforcement of these issues and where we need to go and what we need to do, we really try to stay away from doing it in a group setting. In a group setting, what we find is that we'll start the conversation. It could be at the FOP Lodge, it could be at a convention somewhere or at a conference, and we have the group setting. They're in the room, they're sitting, they're listening intently. And as we start going and talking about this, doing it in a good way, that work, you'll see them, the heads perk up, they'll sit up and they start leaning a little forward, and they're like, damn, I never thought of it that way. You can just see the eyes open up. Then all of a sudden, the good old how can I say, the cop's cop, right? The guy that's been there for 25, 30 years, yeah, who's sitting back like this, and he'll say something like, say we're talking about, or so we had a question about driving under the influence of cannabis, right? And he'll be sitting back here and say, yeah, come on, man, this is a bunch of bullshit. You know it, I know it. Everybody in here knows it, that we're going to have people driving stoned all over the daggone place out there. There's no way in the world we're going to agree to legalizing cannabis. And he uses the word like we and us and all that, and he's looking around at people. And first of all, nobody in that crowd wants to rebuff, wants to push back against that guy, because that's the guy, right? Nobody wants to push back. So if you don't have a presenter who is savvy enough to be able to, to come back and answer, to confront that guy, and to do it in a way where you're not disrespectful, but by asking the right questions. And so if you're not talented enough or savvy enough to do that, you just lost the room, because a group think, because of, just in that policing world, you want to be as part of that group or that crowd as you can be. And you don't want to say or do anything different than the crowd. And when that guy speaks up, that's the crowd speaking for the most part. So we tell our speakers, we tell our members, speak to people one-on-one. and then when they ask the questions, you answer the questions, and you answer the questions a lot of time with asking them a question, but speak to them one-on-one. It's hard. It's very difficult to get an active cop, especially if they're like members of a drug squad or a drug unit or another unit. It's very difficult to get them to do something that's different than the rest of their squad or crew, because they don't want to be ostracized. They don't want to feel like when they're out there on patrol, they don't want to feel like they're by themselves, because they want to make sure they get backup when they need backup. And it's just a very interesting world. But again, I think that we have done enough work over the past 10 to 20 years to create a significant groundswell within policing, especially as these states continue to come on board, online one after another with cannabis. Again, it's really this can drop it any day now. It could literally drop any day now. The floodgates open up, and then the feds move on.
Are there any police forces that you know of, Neill? I know the New York Police Department initially they had dropped testing for THC, but then immediately put it back on. Are there any police forces that you can think of in the U.S. that are no longer testing for THC?
That's a really good question, and this is why it's a difficult question to answer, is because in most states, by far, it's not that the police department that sets those standards. It's not an individual police department. It is, in some states, they refer to as the police certification regulatory as POST, Police Officer Standards and Training, which is run by the state, and they certify every police officer who's hired by an individual police department. In the state of Maryland, it's called the Maryland Police and Correctional. No, it's no longer correctional. Maryland Police Training Commission. So they set those standards of testing for THC. There might be a few states where you can do it as an individual police department. Now, you can set higher standards, but you can't go below what those state standards are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Alburn.
Neill, we're getting close to the end, and I wanted you not to depart from us without saying you're forgiven for arresting all those cannabis people in your past. You did your job. We've all been where we had to do our job. Yeah, you're welcome. Just to support your position now, which of course I agree with. You might know this book, but it was written by a guy named Scott Baum, and it's called Smoke and Mirrors. It's probably 20 years old, and Scott interviewed 200 government employees, ex-government employees, who had been somehow involved in the war on drugs. And now they were ex, and he asked them, did you think you did the right thing? And they said, at the time I did my job, but I would never do it again. Now I think that the number was 199 out of 200 of those men and women thought the war on drugs was not the right thing to do. But Neill, thank you for your service. You've done a good job for a lot of people in a lot of places. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to, say this, and of course, thanks for that. I appreciate that, Al. I'm involved in I'm actually a plaintiff, one of a few plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the Department of Justice right now regarding medical cannabis and the Second Amendment. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping to be able to make the October 12th. There's going to be so there's a motion to dismiss by the Department of Justice. And there should be a hearing in Tallahassee on October 12th, and I think I'm going to be able to make that. And so, as the plaintiff, my position is so I've had a number of back surgeries, dealing with some pain issues, trouble sleeping at night. And I know I still have some maybe some mild depression issues from policing and some of the stuff, but mainly for me, I got this pain issue. I have taken opiate pain medication in the past to deal with it. I just had knee surgery, so that's another thing that's working on me, but mainly my back and my neck. So I got here in Florida 2 years ago, and within the past year, I applied for my medical cannabis card here in the state of Florida. Also, since moving to the state of Florida from Maryland, I've been able to, I like to shoot, and I've been able to buy a number of guns, and I've bought a number of guns. But I realized that if I'm using medical cannabis, I can't buy guns. I can't possess guns. I have a national concealed carry permit as a retired law enforcement official. And now I haven't used medical cannabis yet, because when I got my card, I realized that, oh, wait a minute, on this federal form, I can't lie and check no as to whether or not I use an illicit drug at the federal level, because cannabis is still illicit. So if I lie, I go to federal prison. If I check yes, I don't get my gun. Now, there's my Second Amendment. So as a plaintiff in this suit against the Department of Justice, my position is I'm being pressured. I have to make a decision between whether or not I want to suffer pain-wise and use these powerful opiate-based pain medications that we know be extremely addictive. Why are you, the federal government, making me choose between my Second Amendment right, especially as a retired law enforcement official? You're making me choose between that and a pain-free life, absent opiate pain medication. You know, why are you making me choose these? And so therefore, you know, they need to settle this. They need to remove cannabis, at least from that form, medical cannabis. They need to, in my opinion, they just need to move it from the scheduling system so that people like me can abide by my state law, get my medical cannabis card, deal with my issues for whatever they are for obtaining that card, and still have and exercise my Second Amendment rights as it relates to buying, purchasing, and carrying firearms.
Absolutely. And that's one that is one that is an issue that we are aiming up and gaining steam toward, because various, you know, we've got almost 40 states now that have medical cannabis, and just due to that basic fact alone, we should have equal enforcement in a sense of access to our Second Amendment across those. I, as a dispensary owner here in California, I can't own a firearm either, and that is has its own problems and issues of being, one, I'm a combat veteran, I know how to handle my weapons, but at the same time, it's the laws that are inherent around me dispensing medical cannabis, as well as, you know, being a veteran on top of that. But it's something that we need to also be inclusive of is, and one of the things the Veterans Action Council wants to do is we want to be more inclusive of our police and first responders, especially in the talk on PTS and suicide, because I know that there's a lot of focus specifically on, you know, veterans and veterans focus specifically, but as you stated very succinctly at the beginning of our discussion, how high the suicide rate is amongst LEOs as well as first responders. So in talks of post-traumatic stress, Second Amendment, etc. I hope the police force and first responders know that they have allies in us veterans, and that we are here, and as voices, that we are here to lend a hand and our voices to the cacophony so that it can be heard loud enough so that we can move things forward. That's it for our discussion for tonight. I want to thank Neill Franklin for joining us. Needless to say, it was a challenging situation with the hurricane that came through yesterday. And again, all the best to your friends and family and to your community there in Fort Myers and the surrounding areas there in Florida. And thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. Do you have anything that you'd like to talk about or plug, or any events that you're coming up that you'd like to speak toward?
No, actually, I don't. My at least my immediate calendar, except for this event here, has been wiped clean because of this hurricane that just came through. As a matter of fact, earlier today, I was supposed to be addressing members of Congress at the Congressional Black Congress up in DC, but the airport here is still closed in Southwest Florida, so that did not happen. And I don't know what's on the horizon, but I would like to just mention one thing, something else that I am working on, and that is in this area of prohibition that continues to get us, this country, in trouble. We're traveling down a same, I'm going to say, dangerous path with another drug that is nicotine. Now, understand, I think we all understand that smoking cigarettes is extremely hazardous to one's health. But I'm, a couple of things real quick. Number one, I'm a 64-year-old man. You know what? If I want to smoke a cigarette, I can smoke a cigarette. I don't smoke, never have smoked. I just wouldn't do it. But right now, the FDA is appearing to be moving forward with banning menthol cigarettes. Now, on its face, you might think, okay, so what's the problem with that? They want to ban the sale and manufacturing of menthol cigarettes here in the United States. But what they fail to understand and realize, we all agree with the health issues, but what they fail to realize from a policing perspective is that within the Black community, 80% of Black smokers, more than 80%, prefer and use menthol cigarettes. Now, if they can no longer buy menthol cigarettes tomorrow from their neighborhood store or gas station, do you really think that that's going to end the use and purchasing of menthol cigarettes within anybody's city or community? The answer is hell no, because they will become just as valuable as other drugs being smuggled across the border. They will be coming from China. Menthol cigarettes will be coming from who knows where. Menthol infusion kits will be sold over the internet and elsewhere. Basically, we would be generating a $30 billion underground illicit market for menthol cigarettes. So you know what? I'll stop selling heroin on a corner and I'll start selling menthol cigarettes on a corner, because you know what? The laws, the penalties are not as severe. However, the competition is just as severe. So guns, tools of the trade, as gangs and crews compete for corners of selling menthol cigarettes. Basically, we haven't learned our lesson from alcohol prohibition or drug prohibition. And here we have the FDA attempting to move forward with something like this. And unfortunately, there are groups out there that don't want to stop at menthol cigarettes. They want to take it clear across the board for all tobacco products. And that would be just another huge disaster for this country. And we would have more violent crime on our streets. And we'd have deadly cigarettes now flowing through our neighborhoods. And with this, when you have any type of illicit market like that, the first people that you hire, that these crews hire, are kids. You know what? So if your goal is to keep cigarettes out of the hands of our future generation, you're just going to open the doors, because they're going to sell to other kids. They're going to take them to school and sell them, and they're going to be the ones carrying the guns. And it's a nightmare. So we're working on that. Hopefully we'll have some success. That was one of the things I wanted to speak to members of Congress about today. But just keep that in your mind when you see this information coming out regarding the FDA. Whatever you can do to push back at it, just tell them, hey, let's not try to solve yet another health issue with cops, courtrooms, and prisons. We don't need it. And violence. We don't need it.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. What an honor it was to have you tonight. Cannot thank you enough for your hard work and dedication over the years and your continued work with Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And we wish you nothing but the best. I would like to, I'm wearing my Bud for Blood shirt that I got today, my hemp shirt. We did a Bud for Blood campaign with Kristen Yoder.
Nice.
Where we got cannabis users to go out and donate blood. So I want to thank
Nice.
her again for that successful campaign. She's actually turning that into an organization. It's been so successful because, cannabis users don't give blood as well as they should. And she's shaming them into giving their blood, and it's working. So keep at it, sister. And again, I want to thank Neill Franklin, our council members, Michael Green, Tony Landry, Gage Amsler, Michael Crowitz, Al Byrne, Nate Landau, Todd Scatini, and Wade Laughter. I myself and Etienne Fontan. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our our V.A.C. Roundtable tonight. It is to enforce or not to enforce with our special guest, Neill Franklin. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Y'all have a
Thank you, guys. Pleasure seeing you all.
Thank you, Neill.
The Veterans Action Council is a Pace Radio Network content provider. You're listening to the Pace Radio Network here at paceradio.net.
The opinions of the individuals during this broadcast are their own, and may not be the opinions of their group or other organizations they may be involved with. All medical advice during our broadcast is not a medical opinion and should be checked with your medical physician.
Enjoy the buzz of legalization with Campbellford Lifestyle Shop. From lights to plant nutrients, books, consumption accessories, and more, we've got all your basics to grow or consume cannabis. Visit our info center or take a look at our piercing services and body jewelry, now available in-store through Campbellford Lifestyle Shop, 17 Bridge Street West, Campbellford.
Limestone City Hydroponics is Kingston, Ontario's hydroponics shop. Take your growing to the next level and create the optimal environment with a tent kit, or maximize your yield with an ebb and flow flood table kit. Either way, Limestone City Hydroponics has more sizes and options to fit your needs. Are you looking for the power of the sun that adapts to your budget? Then look no further, as they have professional grow lighting. They have indoor grow systems that are easy and cost effective, with many options to fit your living space and lifestyle. Cultivate your growing potential. We have everything you need to succeed. And if you can't make it to the store, they offer local delivery to the greater Kingston area. Remember, when you're looking for experts to help you grow, then look no further than the locally owned Limestone City Hydroponics, 105 Sunderland Drive in Kingston, Ontario. Call them at 613-548-0420. We are people advocating cannabis education here at paceradio.net.